He found the man in a dry creek bed. The creek had not held water in 11 weeks. The banks were cracked and pale, the kind of white that clay turns when the sun has finished with it. The man was on his back. His hat was gone. 2 holes in his chest, one through the left shoulder, the other lower, where the ribs protected nothing worth protecting. The blood had dried black days ago. 3 days without water under the Arizona sun will change a man. It will take the fight out of most. It will take the memory of why there was a fight in the first place. It will leave something that is still technically alive, but has begun the long negotiation with dying. The man in the creek bed had stopped negotiating. He was waiting. The gunslinger sat on his horse above the bank and looked down at what was left of the man who had tried to kill him 6 months before. He knew the face even without the hat. He had seen it clear in the moment before the ambush, just long enough to recognize it, just long enough to know that recognition would not save him. The man had taken his shot from 30 yards, clean, professional, the kind of shot that ends a discussion. The gunslinger had crawled 2 miles with blood soaking his shirt before he found a doctor whose hands did not shake. Now the man who had done that work was dying in a creek bed, shot again, left again. The men who had hired them both had cleaned up their loose ends the way men clean up loose ends when the work is finished and the contracts no longer matter. The gunslinger did not move for a long time. He listened. The desert was doing what it always did. Nothing. No voices, no hoofbeats, no wind worth calling wind. Just the silence that lives inside the heat, the kind that presses against the ears and makes a man aware of his own pulse. He dismounted. He knelt beside the dying man. The man's eyes were open, filming over, but they tracked the movement. Something inside that ruined body still registered a presence, still cataloged threat. The gunslinger reached for his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and held it to the man's cracked lips. He did not pour it fast. He poured it the way water should be given to a man who has forgotten what it feels like to want something that does not hurt. Slow, patient, enough to wet the mouth, enough to remind the body that it had not given up yet. The man swallowed. A sound came from his throat, something between a breath and a word, but no word formed. The gunslinger set down the canteen. He opened his saddlebag and took out the bandage strip he used for his own wounds. He tore it with his teeth and pressed it against the shoulder wound, then the chest. The blood that came was dark and slow. The body had already begun its long retreat. He worked without speaking. There was nothing to say. The man who had shot him deserved nothing from him, and he was not the kind who gave things because they were deserved. He gave them because he could, because the man was dying in a creek bed and no one else was coming. He lifted the man under the arms. The man weighed almost nothing. The desert had already taken what it was owed. The gunslinger carried him to the horse and hoisted him across the saddle, face down, the way a man carries cargo he does not expect to survive the trip. He mounted. He rode east until he found a line cabin, long abandoned, walls still standing, shade enough to keep the worst of the sun off. He lowered the man onto the floor. He left the canteen. He left the rest of the bandages. Then he mounted again and rode west. The man in the creek bed had tried to kill him. The gunslinger had given him water and a chance. That was the whole of it. There was nothing else to call it, and no one he needed to explain it to. The desert accepted what happened in it without comment. Men died in creek beds, and men rode away. The sun kept its count, and the heat kept its silence. Nothing changed, and nothing needed to change. But something had happened. Even in the desert, even in the silence, something had happened. The creek bed faded into the long ordinary that makes up most of a life. Months passed the way months do in the Arizona territory. One day hot, and then another day hot, and then a rain that came and went before anyone could believe it had come at all. The gunslinger moved through the territory the way he always moved. He arrived in towns that did not want him, and left towns that could not forget him. He did the work that men pay other men to do when the law is a suggestion, and justice is a word that means different things to different people. He was professional. He was precise. He did not enjoy it, and he did not pretend he did. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a man who has done things he will not name. It is not guilt. It is not pride. It is the silence that fills the space where other men would put a story. He had learned to live inside that silence the way he had learned to live inside the desert. It was not comfortable, but it was honest, and it did not pretend to be anything else. In the spring of 1881, the gunslinger took a contract in the hill country east of Tucson. The pay was good. The work was familiar. A man had made enemies, and those enemies had money, and those enemies wanted the problem removed. The gunslinger was the kind of problem remover who got results, and so he went. He rode into the area on a Tuesday. He scoped the terrain on Wednesday. He identified the positions of the 7 men who had been sent to watch the property and kill anyone who came near it. He counted them twice. He counted the angles 3 times. He did not count on being seen before he was ready. A boy on a ridge spotted him at mid-morning. The boy was not more than 15, riding a horse that was too big for him, and he turned that horse up the canyon trail fast enough that the gunslinger knew what was coming before the first shot cracked the air. He was pinned down by noon. 7 men, good positions, high ground on 3 sides. The arroyo he had used for cover was now a grave he had dug for himself with his own careful planning. They had him in a place where a horse could not run, and a man could not crawl without exposing himself to at least 3 angles of fire. The sun moved across the sky and the shadows shortened, and the gunslinger understood that the math was simple and the answer was not in his favor. He had perhaps 4 hours of light. After that, darkness would make movement possible, but it would also make his position impossible to defend. They would rush him in the dark the way men rush things they fear in the dark. He would take some of them with him. He knew that, but the numbers were not his friends, and he had stopped expecting them to change. He pressed his back against the arroyo wall and listened to the men above him talking. They were not in a hurry. They knew what they had. They were going to wait and let the dark and the thirst do the work they were being paid to avoid. A man can learn a great deal about how he feels about dying by noticing what he thinks about in the hours before it arrives. The gunslinger thought about the creek bed. He thought about a man with no water and 2 holes in his chest, and the silence that had pressed against his ears as he knelt beside him. He did not think about it the way a man thinks about a memory. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a fact. It was simply what had happened. A thing that existed in the world the way a rock exists or a shadow exists. He had given water to a man who tried to kill him. He had set him on a horse and left him with a chance. He was not thinking about being repaid. Men who do things for repayment are not doing the things they think they are doing. They are doing a transaction and calling it something else. The gunslinger had learned this a long time ago, in a place he no longer visited in his memory. There was no transaction. There was only what had happened and what was happening, and the thin line between them that sometimes closed and sometimes did not. The line did not close. He heard the first hoofbeat at the far edge of the hearing. He thought it was one of the 7 repositioning, riding to cut off an angle he had not considered. He adjusted his own position and pressed the wall harder and waited. Then he heard the second hoofbeat, from a different direction. Then the third. The men above him went quiet. The talking stopped. The gunslinger listened from below and counted the hoofbeats the way he had counted everything else in his life. Carefully, without assumption, watching the numbers add up in a direction he had not predicted. A voice from the ridge, a man's voice calling down to the 7. "You have 30 seconds to leave. 29. The gunslinger did not move. He listened. The men above were arguing. He could hear the shift of weight, the sudden tension that comes over men when the situation they thought they understood reveals itself to be something else. There was a sound of a hammer being pulled back, then another. 22. The voice from the ridge was calm, not loud, not threatening in the way that men threaten when they are trying to sound dangerous. Calm the way a man is calm when he has already decided what he is going to do, and the waiting is simply the waiting. 15 seconds. A horse screamed somewhere. The sound cut through the canyon like a knife through cloth, high and raw and wrong. The first man on the far side broke from cover and ran, then a second from the opposite ridge. The gunslinger heard boots hitting rock and the desperate scramble of men who had been the hunters and were now the prey. 3 more followed. Then the last 2, the ones who had been closest to the gunslinger's position, who understood that running was a conversation and they had been speaking too long. They ran too. They did not run toward the ridge with the voice. They ran the other direction, down the canyon, toward the open country where a man might outrun whatever was coming from the ridge. They did not make it. The gunslinger heard the shots, 3 of them, close together, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls so that it was impossible to tell exactly where they came from. 2 men went down. He heard the body hit the rock. The third man made it another 20 yards before the 4th shot took him. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of the desert. It was a held silence, the kind that forms around a moment that has not yet decided what it is. Then a man came down from the ridge. He was riding a gray horse. He was wearing a gun belt that was not new and a hat that had seen better years. He came down the slope the way a man comes down when he has been watching long enough to know where every piece of cover is and has decided that cover is no longer necessary. Behind him, 6 more riders appeared on the ridge. They spread out without being told. They took positions the way men take positions when they have done this before and do not need instructions. They watched the canyon without speaking. Their hands stayed near their guns. The man on the gray horse reached the arroyo and dismounted. He walked to the edge and looked down at the gunslinger. He was older than the creek bed had left him. The kind of older that comes from a body that did not think it would survive and then did. and spent the time since then trying to decide what that meant. There was gray in his beard. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 2 years before. But he was alive. The gunslinger looked up at him. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that had not already been said in a creek bed 2 years before. The man from the creek bed held out his hand. The gunslinger took it. He climbed out of the arroyo. His back was stiff and his mouth was dry, and the sun was getting low, and the 6 men on the ridge had not moved a muscle since they arrived. The man from the creek bed had brought water. He handed over the canteen, and the gunslinger drank. Not fast, not slow, the way a man drinks when he has been without and is not anymore, and knows the difference. They sat by a fire that night. The 6 men had gone. The canyon was quiet. The man from the creek bed had built the fire without asking, and the gunslinger had let him, and now they sat across from each other, and the flames moved between them the way flames do, without patience and without mercy. The man from the creek bed opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything. 2 years of searching and riding and asking questions in towns that did not want to answer them, all of it leading to a canyon in the Arizona hill country, where 7 men had pinned down the only man who had ever given him water when he deserved to die without it. The gunslinger raised one hand, just that, the palm, briefly, toward the man. The man stopped. "Water," the gunslinger said. That was all. The man from the creek bed looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. The desert pressed its silence against them from every direction. Somewhere a night bird called once and did not call again. The man understood. He rose. He walked to his gray horse. He mounted without looking back. He rode north, following the stars that had always pointed that direction, toward whatever life he had rebuilt in the 2 years since a man he tried to kill had knelt in a dry creek bed and decided that dying was not something he would do alone. The gunslinger watched him go. He watched until the horse and the man and the gray shape of them dissolved into the dark, and the dark became indistinguishable from the dark that had always been there. Then he put another piece of wood on the fire and sat back down. He did not sleep for a long time. He sat with the fire and the silence and the specific quality of aloneness that lives in the desert at night, when the heat finally relents and the cold comes in like a guest who is not sure he is welcome. He thought about the creek bed. He thought about a man with 2 bullets in him and no water, and the kind of eyes that had already given up. He thought about the canteen in his hand, and the decision that was not a decision, that was simply the thing he did, because he could not do anything else. He thought about the 7 men in the canyon, and the 8 men on horses, and the math that had not added up, and then had. He thought about a man riding north. He did not think about what it meant. He did not think about debt or honor or the things that men write about later when they are trying to explain what happened to people who were not there. He thought about what had happened. He held the facts in his mind the way he held the silence, without decoration, without story. Facts are enough in the desert. They are all a man can carry and all a man needs. The fire burned down to embers. The stars moved the way stars do. Somewhere far to the north, a man on a gray horse was riding toward a life that had been given back to him by a stranger who would never give his name. The gunslinger did not ride north. He had never ridden north. He saddled his horse in the first gray light of morning and he rode south, into the territory that was still territory, into the towns that still had problems that needed removing, into the work that men pay other men to do. He did not look back. He never did. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. There is always another story in the territory, and the nameless gunslinger always finds the ones who need finding. Tell me about a moment when mercy cost you something. Tell me about the debt you never expected to repay. Subscribe if you want to stay on the trail. The desert does not hold on to things, and neither does the nameless gunslinger. But the stories stay. They stay the way the heat stays, long after the fire goes out. The nameless gunslinger will return.